Haunted Ohio, Vol.1 by Chris Woodyard. Chapter 4. The Ghostly Grandpa. Children in the Supernatural. From the Cradle to the Grave. Percy Bysshe Shelley. It is said that all children have psychic gifts that they lose as they grow older. Did you have an imaginary playmate that was very real to you? Perhaps it was a ghost. A ghost of Christmas past. In Springfield on Christmas Eve, 1904, young Frederica Kolblitz was putting the finishing touches on the Christmas tree decorations. Her mother, who had been ill, called downstairs asking her for a glass of water. Like some older houses, the house had a front and back staircase that met at a landing, and as Frederica climbed up the back staircase that led from the kitchen, she saw her mother going down the front stairs. "Mother, here is your water," she called, but her mother didn't seem to hear. Frederica turned and followed her. "Mother, here's your glass of water," she said. Her mother walked on. Frederica followed her down into the front hall. She said again, "Mother, here is your glass of water." When her mother didn't answer, Frederica said a little impatiently, "Why on earth don't you take it? Where are you going?" Her mother had turned into the dark front parlor. Frederica watched as her mother walked hauntingly around the parlor, sometimes stopping as if she was searching for matches to light the gas lights. "Are you looking for matches?" Frederica asked. Suddenly, Frederica saw the outline of her mother's body, blurring as if the room was getting darker. Her mother's form grew fainter and fainter and then vanished. The glass of water slipped from her numb hand and broke on the hall floor. Frederica started to shake, thinking that her mother had died upstairs and that she had just seen her mother's ghost. Racing upstairs, she found her mother safely in bed. Neither of them could ever account for the strange apparition. And death shall be no more. Only rarely are children's visions of the dead shared by adults, as in this episode which happened in Columbus, 1921. Becky lived with her parents in her grandparents' house. Next door lived their minister, Mr. Cowell, his wife, and their 4 teenage daughters. The church Mr. Cowell led was very conservative. Its members tried to follow the Bible to the very letter. The Cowells didn't even prepare food on the Sabbath, but made it on the night before. Despite this rigid code, their God was love. Becky thought that the gentle, saintly minister was a very nice man, but she believed that Mrs. Cowell was an angel straight from heaven. She smiled when Becky hung over the fence, chattering gaily as Mrs. Cowell picked apples from the backyard tree. She gave the little girl milk and mugs and plates of doll-sized apple tarts for picnic tea parties. But one day Mrs. Cowell died of heart trouble very suddenly. So suddenly young Becky could not or refused to grasp that fact. She overheard the adults whispering that Mrs. Cowell's body had been packed on ice in the funeral home until the day of the funeral. Embalming would have violated the biblical ashes to ashes, dust to dust. She shivered as the thought of how cold Mrs. Cowell must be feeling, packed up on ice like a fish. This was Becky's first experience with death. The night before the funeral, she could not sleep. She heard her father get up and walk past her door to the bathroom without turning on any lights. She listened to his footsteps creak on the landing. Suddenly he stopped, and Becky heard her father give a smothered exclamation. It was just the excuse she had been waiting for. She was out of bed and by his side in a flash. He was standing by the hall window and at the head of the stairs, staring down into the Cowells' dining room. Becky followed his gaze and saw a small light in the room, like a newly lit candle just beginning to shine. In this light walked Mrs. Cowell. The dumbfounded father and daughter could see her plainly. It looked as though she was walking in a halo of light, not walking in and out of a pool of candle or lamplight. Mrs. Cowell looked very well and happy as they had ever seen her. It looked to Becky like she was just going about her housework. Why doesn't she switch on the electric light?" she asked her father. But when she looked at him, he seemed dazed, like someone in a trance. Becky turned back to watch Mrs. Cowell. They watched her for some time, probably 10 or 20 minutes. Becky asked her again, "Why doesn't she just turn on the light?" Again, she got no answer. Shortly after this, Miss Cowell and the light both walked out of their range of sight, and the glow faded, as though she had walked into another room. Becky went back to bed, her questions still unanswered, but now she went easily to sleep. The next morning at breakfast, Becky's grandmother spoke about Mrs. Cowell's funeral and burial. "She isn't dead," Becky said, eating oatmeal. "Daddy and I saw her." Conversation stopped dead. Everyone looked at Becky, then at her father. He squirmed. With his eyes on his plate, he said, "Yeah, we saw her. Walking in the dining room last night." Becky's grandmother said, "Oh, Edward, you couldn't have. You must have seen one of the girls." "She isn't dead," Becky cried. "I know Mrs. Cowell when I see her." Becky's grandmother left the table, gesturing imperiously at her son to follow her. Becky never knew what her grandmother said to her father, but the incident was not mentioned again by either of them. Their silence did not change Becky's mind. She knew that she had seen her friend, alive, and a short time after the funeral, Becky got confirmation of that fact. One morning, Becky went to the backyard, and there, next door in the bright sunlight, picking apples, was Mrs. Cowell. "Mrs. Cowell!" exclaimed Becky. The woman turned and smiled and waved at the little girl in the most everyday manner possible. Becky tore around the house, through their gate and the Cowell's gate, and back around the house to her. But when Becky got to the backyard, the woman was gone. Becky knocked on the kitchen door, supposing that Mrs. Cowell was inside. One of the daughters answered her knock, and when the girl asked for Mrs. Cowell, the daughter picked up the child and hugged her. Then she sat her on her knee, gave her a sugar cookie, and made her laugh with a puppet made out of a knotted handkerchief, until Becky forgot why she had come. The next day, Becky saw Mr. Cowell in the yard and remembered. She came close to the fence, called to him in excitement, and began to tell him about seeing his wife. The man took a large white handkerchief from his pocket, put it over his face, and walked into the house, overcome with sorrow, brought on by the cruel innocence of a child. News of this reached Becky's grandmother. She sat Becky down and gave her a stern talking to. She said that Becky was never to go around anymore telling people that she saw Mrs. Cowell. Years passed. Becky went to school, and the Cowell girls married. The minister, too, married again. Many experiences had jostled the memory of the first Mrs. Cowell into a corner of her mind. To the growing Becky, she was an enigma, a puzzling incident that troubled her vaguely, although she had come to accept that Mrs. Cowell was indeed dead. Many more years passed. Becky's mother died, and her father was devastated. Desperate for consolation, he consulted mediums, receiving some small amount of comfort, messages purporting to come from his dead wife. 14 years after Becky's mother died, her father fell ill. As he approached death, he was sad and anxious and afraid. Despite his contacts with the afterlife, he harbored lingering doubts. He still did not know for certain. One day he said to Becky from his bed, "How do I know that I'll see your mother again? The messages could have been mind reading. So many have died, but none have come back. Not one ever came back to me. I never saw any of them." Suddenly her memory blazed up in Becky's mind. "You saw Mrs. Cowell," she said to him. "What?" he said, staring at his daughter. "You saw Mrs. Cowell that night in the dark in the hall. We both saw her down there in the dining room." As he remembered, it was like a light had been turned on behind his eyes. His features seemed almost luminous. "I did," he said slowly, wondering. How could I have forgotten it? We did see her, didn't we? And these 40 years we never spoke of it. Becky left her father musing on the past. He died later that week, easily, a man who looks forward to a reunion with his loved ones. Becky was certain it was because of their shared memory of Mrs. Cowell. Says Becky, "We saw her. We saw her. We saw her. And we kept silent for too long." The ghostly grandpa. The house was just an ordinary, cute 2-bedroom ranch house in an ordinary suburban neighborhood in East Dayton. The night in 1982 the Brill family moved in. Karen Brill fell into bed, exhausted from shifting boxes and furniture. Something woke her at 2:30 a.m. Standing by her bed was a little old man. There was nothing at all alarming about him. She certainly didn't think he was a burglar. He had white hair and was dressed in blue pajamas with a navy and burgundy robe over it, and he wore navy slippers. When I saw him, I felt so peaceful that I couldn't make myself move. I immediately drifted into peaceful sleep. I never felt fear at all. That's what makes the sighting so unique. I felt pulled into sleep. In the morning, she told her husband about her very vivid dream. Then she put it out of her mind, and she spent the busy day unpacking. Their neighbors, the Wilsons, invited them over for a cookout that evening. Making small talk, Brill mentioned the dream. Miss Wilson gave a scream and ran into her house. Mr. Wilson looked uneasy. "Do you know," he said, "that you just described Mr. Schlutz? He lived in your house until his death 6 months ago." Strange as it was, Karen had too much else to think about. A new house, a young child, and another one on the way, to dwell on a dream. But a month before the birth of their second child, another mysterious incident occurred. Karen was trying to steer Belly, laundry basket, and son Peter down the basement stairs to the washing machine. Peter jerked away and flew headfirst down the steps. Horrified and stunned, Karen watched as he seemed to float above the wooden steps. He gently bounced one, then swerved to avoid a pillar. Finally, he touched down lightly on the basement floor. Karen scrambled down the stairs to the child and snatched him up. She stripped him completely, but there was not a mark on him. There was also a closet door that would never stay closed, says Karen. When family or friends stopped by, we would tell them about our ghost and how the ghost would keep opening the closet door. A few moments later, I hung up the guests' coats. It never failed. The closet doors popped open when everyone was least expecting it. After new baby Allison arrived, a second crib was added to the nursery. Karen and her husband often heard their babies jabbering and giggling. If either parent went to the room, the babies would point to the corner of the room as if wishing to introduce someone they alone could see. Sometimes their pantomime was so realistic, Karen almost believed she could see a shape gesturing and making faces at the baby. Karen's husband worked third shift, so she was often alone at night. One night, both children had colds, and Karen decided to let them sleep in her bedroom. Allison snored in her bassinet. Peter had a bad earache and shared his mother's bed, tossing in pain. He finally fell asleep curled up against her. Karen dozed off too. She woke up in the middle of the night to a terrifying noise coming from the baby's bedroom. When the sound was unmistakable. Someone was in there shaking both of those old cribs. They were shaking and rattling so bad, I thought surely the neighbors would hear. Finally the noise stopped. I was scared, but I suddenly knew I had to check it out. Someone might have broken in and could possibly harm my children. I got up and I looked to the other bedroom, and then the rest of the house, and there was no one there. But someone had been shaking those bars furiously. That someone, Karen believes, was the old man, lost somewhere beyond death, desperately afraid that he had lost his little friends. Oh, the ghost ate nuts. Lonzo Green, author of the Tales from Buckeye Land, recalls his mother telling the following story. If anyone else had told it, said Green, I could not have believed it. When Mrs. Green was a child, she and her brothers and sisters were cracking and eating hickory nuts in the hall by the stairs of her family home. Suddenly, as in biblically accounts, an old man appeared in their midst. He spoke to them kindly, and they offered him some of their hickory nuts. He shook his head when they tried to put the nuts in his hand. Did he think the nuts would fall through? Instead, he gestured that they should place the nuts on one of the stairs. The children did so, and the old man picked up the nuts and ate them with relish, smiling and talking to the children. After a while, he walked out into the sunlit yard, and, in full sight of the children and their mother who had joined them, he vanished. A small medium. Child mediums were popular during the heyday of spiritualism. One of the youngest was Miss Lovejoy of Cincinnati. Miss Lovejoy of Cincinnati brought with her a baby of 4 years who was a remarkable medium. 4 months. Miss Lovejoy of Cincinnati brought with her a baby of 4 months who was a remarkable medium. We have been accustomed to sit around the cradle whilst the little one lies asleep, ever since she has been here, and always receive satisfactory responses from our spirit friends, either by raps or rockings of the cradle. If the baby wakes during our cycle, she never cries, but seems, by the happy smile over her sweet face, at the delight with which she crows along with the raps, to receive some pleasant influence from the power which she is operating. Last evening, April 3rd, as we were holding a circle around the cradle, I asked the spirits why the Christians did not give the signs which are promised to the believers in the last chapter of St. Mark. When the spirits rapped out by the alphabet, because the Christians of this century were believers with their lips, but not many of their hearts were far from God, but too many of their hearts were far from God. They added, they would show what belief in the truth of the Scripture meant through that baby tomorrow, and prove that it was something more than lip service. The next day, this morning, as I returned to dinner, I found my wife and Miss Lovejoy sitting in the veranda outside the house. They rose up and went to the parlor with me, also accompanied by Mr. Newman, my overseer from Mississippi, who was along with me. On entering the parlor, we were all four horrified to behold the baby's cradle, literally a mass of flames. A spark from the pine fire probably had flown out, and the cradle was had been incautiously left near the open fireplace, had taken fire, and was now wrapped in flames. I shall never forget the shrieks of the women, or my own feelings of horror at the sight. But Mr. Newman gallantly rushed over towards the blazing mast, plunged his hand in, snatched the infant from the cradle, and rolled in its blazing nightdress on the matting of the floor, until the fire was extinguished. I seized a bucket of water at the door, brought by Sam for our horses, and hurled it at the cradle, by which the flames were soon put out. But the strange part of the story is that the little one never cried, nor even whimpered at that, and that, though its nightdress was burned to a cinder, not a single scorch can be found on its body, nor the least token of injury. Even the bit of hair on its little poll was not singed. Miss Lovejoy is now in bed, attended by my wife, and in painful condition of hysterical emotions. But the little angel, guarded sign of true Christianity, is merely crowing in the arms of her nurse, Cherry, on the floor at my feet as I write. The spectral sibling. In a small town in Ohio, the Potter sisters shared a bedroom. One night, 10-year-old Ruth wandered into her parents' neighboring bedroom and complained to her mother that her older sister, Shirley, was standing by her bed and wouldn't go away. Groggily, Mrs. Potter went with Ruth, saw that Shirley was asleep in her own bed, and decided that Ruth had imagined the whole thing. Before long, Ruth was back again, complaining that not only was Shirley standing by her bed, she wouldn't say a word. She just stood there looking at her. Once again, Miss Potter found that Shirley was sound asleep and scolded Ruth, warning her not to bother her again or she'd get a spanking. And all through an endless night, Ruth asked the silent Shirley to please go back to her own bed. Shirley just looked down at her with a cold stillness that terrified her sister. The next morning, Ruth left Shirley sleeping, for she was not very strong and needed extra sleep. Later, when it was time to make the beds, her mother called Shirley. There was no response. Miss Potter looked closer and, to her horror, found that her daughter was dead. The doctor who examined her believed that she had died soon after going to bed.